So thank you very much for having me here to present this paper, and thank you to all that joined the presentation. My name is Jacopo Gambato. I'm a PhD student about to finish my PhD at University of Mannheim, and this is a work co-author with Martin Peitz called the Platform-Enabled Information Disclosure. And to kind of set the stage, I would like to start with a banal observation, which is that available information on what are buyers' preferences tend to affect firm pricing when we talk about the equilibrium market outcomes. And we know easily that whenever a monopoly seller has buyer data, he will want to try to price discriminate, setting high prices for high valuation buyers. At the same time, when we know we have competing sellers with buyer data, they would want to try to have high prices for buyers with a preference for their own product compared to the alternatives available on the market, and low prices to contest consumers that might have a preference for other products available. More recently, and especially through the work by Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman that I will mention quite a bit during this presentation, we know that if consumers control access to their data, they would disclose information strategically in a way that accounts for the pricing effect of their own individual disclosure. And we think this is important to think about and important to understand how it actually works in a more digital focused setting, because recent regulation has been pushing very hard to increase buyers' agency in the digital economy. In particular, we can think of the GDPR, in which there is very explicitly mentioned that the individual's consent to data collection when interacting with sellers online should be at the forefront of the matter. And again, from the work by Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman, we know that buyers that disclose their information voluntarily would do so in a way that would favor them when trading and potentially harm sellers. So with all this in mind, we want to try to understand how all these things mesh together and interact when we talk about a platform environment. In particular, the research questions that we want to answer to are: would a platform allow for buyers' voluntary disclosure, given how it changes the balance of power between buyers and sellers? What are the privately optimal choices and whether they are aligned with the interest of buyers and or the sellers? And whether or not, on top of the already available regulated right to be hidden when interacting online and having their information hidden, GDPR does that already, if there should be regulation about the right to disclose information and about the disclosure technology in place in the digital economy. So let's think about the platform for a second, and let's think about the fact that an e-commerce platform is special in a sense, in the sense that it can design the environment itself in which the economic interactions take place. Most e-commerce platforms, and the one we consider specifically, tend to monetize on the seller side. So it is intuitive to think that the platform interest would be aligned with the ones of the sellers, because effectively they share the same pie. However, because we're talking about a digital platform, we know that buyers should be or need to be persuaded to join as well. And with cross-site network effects, which make a platform problem a platform problem, the interaction becomes even more complicated. All of this to say that the optimal design, when we talk about governance of a platform, is context-specific and therefore worth analyzing, because for different cases, different results might apply, and different kind of intervention on a regulatory level might be important to consider. More in general, we talk about two strands of literature with this work. The one on platform governance design that I briefly mentioned, but more in general about the information design literature. In this slide, I try to put a little bit of names of work related in one way or another. For example, the paper by Tat-How is very clearly about design choices of the platform, but in a more general sense than what we do. Well, what we do specifically is try to think of the information design as a specific choice and how that affects the equilibrium between buyers and sellers. On the information design sense instead, as I mentioned, we will take a lot from the paper by Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman, and the way in which they model information design and how consumers may be able to share their information will affect the way gains from trade are split. And this will come into play into how the platform or the regulator might choose to allow or not allow consumers to disclose their information. In general, what we do here is we try to compare the private and public optimal information design choices, specifically in a platform environment, because of its importance in digital economy at large, and because of how relevant some of these specific platforms can be or are in the digital economy. So as a quick preview of the results, what we show is that when buyer participation is exogenous, which is the closest way to get our framework to match the one of Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman, the platform always chooses to restrict disclosure because since there is no need to attract consumers to the platform always aligns with the seller's interest rather than the buyer's. However, when we allow for buyer participation to be endogenous and to react to the participation of the sellers, then the platform may allow for richer disclosure through to account for the network effects and to have more consumers join, to have more sellers join, to generate the attraction spiral that we know about the platform environment, if these network effects are strong enough. However, we also show that in some cases, the platform may restrict the disclosure possibility of consumers beyond both buyers and sellers' interests. And this comes out because of a neat interaction between the disclosure regime selected and the optimal fee that the platform would charge to sellers in combination with the disclosure regime selected. And finally, we show that this is robust both to having monopoly sellers active on the platform and duopoly sellers specifically competing halal telling or with horizontally differentiated product on the same platform. Now, to jump right into how the model is set up, I start with considering how buyers and sellers are modeled. I then move to the selection of the platform and the regulator, and then I would like to discuss a little bit some of these assumptions to kind of contextualize them given the problem at hand. So we think of buyers and sellers as unit masses of product categories on one side, in which each seller sells a single product, and they're either alone in the product category or there is two of them competing halal telling, as I mentioned, and a unit mass of buyers. Each product category has an opportunity cost extracted from a uniform distribution, FS, and the buyers also have an opportunity cost of entering, but they're split in two masses. We have a mass of eager buyers, which have no opportunity cost of entering and therefore are assumed to always join the platform, and a mass of hesitant buyers who have a cost of entry that is also distributed uniformly that need to decide whether to join or not, accounting for the possibility of potentially not having, positive expected utility from doing so. What's crucial here is that we assume the buyers do not know their product category of interest before joining. Therefore, while the eager consumers have no cost and therefore enter regardless, the hesitant buyers need to understand that because they don't know what they want before joining the platform, they don't know if they will find what they want after joining it. And this will depend on how many sellers join on the other side. For the monopoly case, on top of their product category of interest, consumer will not know exactly their valuation for the one product available on the product category. While for the hoteling line, we assume that the consumers do not know exactly their preferences for the two options made available, which means that in this environment, both buyers and seller only join if they have non-negative expected utility or profit. Going to the platform, there are two design decisions in a sense. There is a proportional fee that we call alpha, always on the sellers and none on the buyers, that is always selected by the platform. While for the disclosure regime, we want to compare the privately optimal choice of disclosure regime made by the platform that tries to maximize profit, or as selected by a regulator that is trying to maximize either consumer surplus or producer surplus in a second best comparison kind of way. And for the disclosure regime, again, we take exactly the ones studied by Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman, and we distinguish between no evidence, in which consumers are not allowed to share any information about their preferences once they join the platform, simple evidence, so that consumers can either share exactly their location or their valuation or none at all, and rich evidence in which partial disclosure is possible, and therefore we have different pooling equilibria or partial pooling equilibria that can arise, again, as described by Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman. The timing is relatively simple. We have the platform first chooses the fee, and either the platform or the regulator selects the disclosure regime active on the platform itself. The sellers learn the opportunity cost and then enter. Buyers do the same and then decide whether to enter or not. After entering, the buyers who did learn their product category of interest and their preferences, and they make their disclosure choices. And given these disclosure choices, prices are set, profits are realized. The equilibrium concept is a perfect Bayesian equilibrium because of this interaction of anticipating buyers that need to decide to enter after sellers. And this is pretty much it. The good thing is that because we build this on top of the Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman result, everything from the period 4 onward effectively is taken from their environment and can be simplified to very simple measures of gains from trade and split of the gains from trade. Now, before moving on with the model, again, I wanted to have a small discussion about the modeling choices that we make, starting from the fact that consumers do not know upfront if their product category of interest is indeed included on the platform. Now, for eager buyers, this is obviously relevant because they don't have an actual cost. In fact, one can think of eager buyers as being already on the platform in a sense, but it does affect the choice of entry of the hesitant buyer because the more product categories are on the platform, the more likely it is that they will find a product category to buy from. It's not extremely realistic if we think about it as a one-shot interaction that consumers do not know what they want before joining. But if one thinks about hypothetical repeated interaction of a consumer on a platform, this is akin to imagining the consumer not knowing to begin with every purchase that he will want to make on the platform, and therefore the consumer cannot anticipate or does not anticipate the whole value that he expects to get from interacting with sellers on the platform. Reduced in a one-shot manner, this effectively is as if the consumer does not know what he wants and discovers it only upon joining the platform. Moreover, this is a neat and simple and tractable way to generate cross-group network effects from sellers to buyers rather than just from buyers to seller, which we are more used to. And second, this one of the choices that we make is to keep everything using uniform distributions. One, because it allows for neat closed form solutions that make comparative statics relatively easy. And second, because with the presence of eager buyers, the uniform distribution alone approximates strictly concave network benefits given the presence of sellers. And in general, this allows us to generate a much richer setting than assuming full participation on at least one of the sides, which again is the most common choice of modeling when trying to capture network effects on a platform. However, for clarity's sake, I should mention that it is difficult to generalize the result that we find to other more general distributions. However, we think that what we can learn, even just with the uniform distribution, can be useful to kind of instruct how to think about this problem, how to think about regulation of information disclosure on a digital environment. Going back to sorry, yes, Professor Kramer?
Yeah, just another question about your modeling choice. You are assuming that the buyers give their information once they know what their valuation is. But in practice, yes, you give the authorization to share your information to the platform generally. And so in some sense, it would be closer to accepting to share before you know what your valuation is. I mean, Facebook can give my valuation to all the advertisers who want it.
So this is what I was trying to convey in the beginning when we talked about our right to disclose, in a sense, because what is currently available is the right to be hidden. So you can tell the platform that you don't want your information shared, but you don't necessarily have control over which information you can share. However, in this hypothetical world that we try to model here, consumers do have the chance to actually decide what to share on the platform after joining it, by creating, in a sense, a right to disclose information specifically rather than choosing to withhold information that is stored. Okay,
thanks.
So going back to the trade phase, as I mentioned, we take the most favorable equilibrium for buyers as derived by Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman. And for a simple graphical representation, we can have the difference between no evidence, simple evidence, rich evidence, for example, on the monopoly case, in which we can see that the moment in which information disclosure is allowed, as per the paper cited, we have that disclosure being available simply increases trade volume, because some consumers under no evidence will not buy at all. But the moment in which they're able to communicate information about themselves to the seller, they can do so in a way that triggers a price that would make the trade happen. And this is especially true in the rich evidence, in which not only the trade happens, but consumers also retain a larger share of the gains from trade during the trading phase itself. And the same can be done when thinking about duopoly. Again, this is taken directly from Ali, Lewis, and Wasserman, in which we see that the ability of consumer to strategically share their information to either both or neither sellers allows them to put pressure on the prices that then drop already from no evidence to simple evidence. And they can do even better with rich evidence, where they can segment themselves in a partial pooling equilibrium that allows them to maintain even more gains from trade and expectation. So going back to the, given this trade phase equilibrium that again we take, we can now talk about the participation decision. And I will start from the monopoly sellers, solve this fully, and then talk about the difference that it makes to have duopoly sellers instead. But effectively, what we show is that given the structure of the trade phase, we can reduce everything from the period 4 onwards to a simple statistic, which is the gain from trade WZ, or the gains from trade W that depends on the disclosure regime Z taken, and in the way these gains from trade are split. We call the split lambda, so that given a disclosure regime, and we have gains from trade W that are split in a proportion lambda to buyers and 1 minus lambda to sellers. And importantly, that the more freedom to disclose is given to consumers, the higher lambda is. So the more freedom they are to disclose information, the more they will retain on the trade phase. So going backward, we can write, because of this two-sided network effects, we can write the proportion of sellers that would join the platform given what the number of buyers they expect to buy, as in this formula. This is simply, given the uniform distribution of the cost of entry. And we can do exactly the same with the buyers themselves, and then combining them, we can get closed form solutions for a measure both of the sellers, on the mass of sellers that would join, and on the mass of buyers that would join, given their cost of entry. And we see that this number depend on the network effects themselves. So on beta, how many consumers are eager and how many consumers are hesitant and they need to be actually induced. They will depend on the split, the gains from trade, and on alpha. So the platform choosing a certain level in their fee when setting up the fee for sellers, they will influence how many sellers and how many buyers will join in equilibrium. And in particular, when we put them back, or when we plug them into a measure for the profit of the platform as a measure of the optimal fee, with simple first order condition, we can obtain the optimal fee, which again depends on the network effects and the gains from trade and how they are split. So that the optimal alpha, the optimal fee selected by the platform, will depend on the disclosure regime selected through these 2 dimensions, but only if there are network effects. As you can see, if beta is 1, this means that there are no network effects in place because all consumers are eager, so they would always join the platform no matter what. And then the fee kind of converges to 1/2 for all disclosure regimes. And the only difference that could arise is how the trades is split and how many gains from trade are actually generated on the platform. So in order to find which disclosure regime would be selected by the various agents, now all we need to do is get closed form solutions, closed form for the profit. This is what we obtain when we plug in the optimal fee, the optimal and the equilibrium entry level of both sellers and buyers. And we can do the same for consumer surplus, again, as a function of the network effects of the split of the gain from trade and the gain generated itself, and the same for the producer surplus. So when we put everything together and when we calculate the gains from trade and the way these are split or the expected utility and the expected profit under the three different disclosure regimes, all we need to do is compare them one-to-one and see for which values which is selected. And for the monopoly sellers, what is immediate to notice is that no evidence is the only one in which trade does not happen with probability 1, which means that from the platform perspective, but also from the buyers and sellers perspective, no evidence is strictly dominated, because this is the only case in which trade is not at the efficient level, and the rich evidence allows for exactly the same amount of gains from trade as no evidence one, or exactly the same split, sorry, of the gain from trade as no evidence one, but with simply more gains from trade, which means that effectively the selection on both the platform and the regulators is between simple evidence and rich evidence. And by direct comparison, we can obtain threshold values that allows us to predict for which values of gains from trade and for the parametric assumption that we make on the uniform distribution, for which values each agent would select what kind of disclosure. And in practice, we have two values of that connect the gains from trade and F, which is the product of the upper limit of the distribution of the cost of entry for sellers and buyers. And depending on whether W is relatively small, intermediate, or large, different disclosure regime would be selected by either the platform or the sellers, while consumers, buyers, would always prefer to have more freedom in this case. And graphically, we can see this for different levels of beta. So when we have a very low beta, it means that the majority of consumers needs to be induced to join the platform. And therefore, we see that we can have different cases. Specifically, we have here on this red area that both the platform and the seller would align in their interest of restricting disclosure, because gains from trade are relatively low. And therefore, it's better to maintain, in a sense, a larger percentage of the gains from trade on the seller side, both for the sellers and the buyers. We have here on the green, in this green area, that both the platform and the sellers align with the consumers in wanting rich evidence to be made available, because this way network effects generate more trade and more value, and everybody benefits from that. But what's more interesting is that in the middle of them, we have an area in which the sellers would want more freedom to disclose, the same as consumers, but the platform actually chooses to restrict it, to have the simple evidence while the other two don't. And I will spend a little more time on that later, but the core intuition here is that the more freedom to disclosure the platform gives to buyers, the lower the optimal fee is that the platform would set on the seller side, which means that in this area, effectively what the platform is doing is it's reducing the trade and trying to get a higher fee to extract more from the sellers with the low cost that enter anyway, rather than allowing more disclosure, reducing the fee, and allow the network effects to be more effective. And we can see that as beta increases, these areas, in a sense, shrink. So we have that for low beta, all three are possible, but as beta increases and network effects gets weaker, the area in which everybody aligns around having rich evidence disappear. And for even higher beta, in which network effects are relatively or very weak, we have that both platform and sellers only ever select the simple evidence. And at the extreme, when we think about the highest beta and no network effects at all, we go back to the idea that the platform always aligns with the sellers and always select to restrict disclosure beyond what consumers would want. Now, if we think of the product categories as being represented by a duopoly rather than a monopoly, we can do exactly the same exercise. And the most striking difference, or the reason why we're interested in seeing these two different models in a sense side by side is that while we monopoly sellers, disclosure in any form generates more gains from trade, and so no evidence was always dominated. This is not true for the duopoly sellers. In fact, with duopoly sellers, as we can see here, the gains from trade are constant no matter the disclosure regime is selected. The only thing that changes is how these are split through the expected utility and the expected profit on the two sides. And we can see here that the more disclosure is given to consumers, the higher the expected utility of consumers and the lower the expected profit of sellers. So after we do exactly the same exercise, we can reobtain the equilibrium levels of entry for both sellers and buyers, the equilibrium alpha, and then compare them side by side. And once again, we can get these closed form solution for threshold values that determine in which areas or for which parameter constellation platform and regulators would choose different levels of disclosure and different fees. And once again, we can represent this graphically, and we see a couple of interesting things, I believe, here. First, we have the same three areas in which platform and sellers align on restricting disclosure or deviating one from the other, the platform restricting disclosure more than the sellers, and an area in which both platform and sellers align in the simple evidence case. But now we also see that in some cases, the consumers actually want themselves to have their ability to disclose be restricted. And we are in this area here in which gains from trade are really, really high. And the reason why this is the case is because due to competition and due to the price effect, a higher gains from trade does not necessarily reflect on more gains from the seller side because prices are fixed in the Hotelling model. So in this area here, consumers themselves want not to be able to disclose information because by restricting them, they give a higher expected profit to sellers, which means that more sellers are willing to enter, which means that there is it's more likely for consumers to find something to purchase, and therefore in this case, even consumer would want to have the sellers be not penalized on the trading phase, which again is it's a very distinguished result from from the one in Ali Lewis and Wasserman that shows that disclosure is always beneficial in a sense to consumers, because in this case, even like if there was the chance, if was given the chance to consumers to disclose information, this would reduce the number of sellers joining, and therefore it would hurt their expected utility on the platform itself. And once again, once we increase beta and make the network effect stronger, we see that the case in which more disclosure is allowed by the platform and the alignment with the sellers disappear. So here too, we have that for very high beta, and especially as beta goes to 1 and the network effects disappear and consumers are already assumed on the platform always ever align with the sellers and sometimes with the buyers too. But in general, it doesn't care about the consumer's preferences. So we can put all of them together and kind of see what are all the possible alignment of interests. And as I mentioned, there are cases in which the platform naturally selects the same disclosure regime that both consumers and sellers would select. And we have that depending on the combination of which kind of competition takes place on the platform, the fee, or the gains from trade, and how easy it is to attract the two sides, they can either align on rich evidence, simple evidence, or no evidence. We also know, we've seen that the platform can sometimes align with the seller side away from the buyer side. But again, we have that the platform can be misaligned with both sellers and buyers, even though supposedly being the platform in the middle between the two, they should be able to coordinate the interest of both depending on the size of network effects. And the reason why this happened, as I briefly mentioned before, is because of the role of the fee and how it interacts with the freedom given to consumers and how these generate different splits of the gains from trade. So normally, the platform does align with sellers, as is intuitive. When there are strong network effects, buyers and sellers tend to benefit more from disclosure, and therefore the more participation makes it so everybody is happier with allowing disclosure. However, when network effects are weak, the sellers benefit from the restricted disclosure because they get to keep more of the gains from trade, and the platform benefit from that as well. However, because of the fact that more freedom of disclosure leads to lower fee as well, this misalignment in interest can emerge in the platform environment. The platform would, in some cases, restrict disclosure beyond what sellers would want because they want to extract a higher fee from the trade. So effectively sacrifices trade volumes to extract the most possible from each interaction, and which is again a surprising result in a sense of knowing that platforms are generally defined by their ability to generate network effects and exploit network effects in a positive sense rather than in a negative one. And in this case, the sellers would prefer more disclosure rather than, because it would be aligned with a lower fee, which again is in strict discrepancy with the result of Ali et al., in which every time more disclosure is given to the buyers, sellers are penalized. But when can we expect this misalignment to arise? Well, the point here is that the misalignments and the different interests of platform consumers and sellers can kind of be reconduced to how strong the network effects are on the environment. So if network effects are weak and it's difficult to attract the marginal buyer or the marginal sellers, and the average gains from trade are not too low so that it's not difficult to attract people, but also not too high so that there is no necessity to attract the other side in a sense, this misalignment between platform and everybody else arises. This can be true, for example, for niche platforms in which there are not a lot of buyers and sellers on the market, so network effects by construction are not necessarily strong, but also for established platforms. So platform in which buyers and sellers are already established on the platform, and there is no need or there is no difficulty in having a mass of trade generated. And this is because, as mentioned throughout the talk, disclosure is used strategically by the platform generally to generate additional trade. So if there is no need to do this, because it's either not worth it or buyers and consumers are already on a platform environment, and I believe this to be realistic for some of the most established e-commerce platform currently active on the digital economy, this is something to think about, and this is something to potentially intervene in. And the reason why is that given what we've seen before and given how the platform would select their own environment and their disclosure regime active on the platform itself, this would always or generally hurt consumers and potentially hurt sellers too. So to conclude, and I think I'm pretty much on time here, what we try to do here is to try to study specifically the role of information disclosure in a trade environment and how the fact that this affects how gains from trade are allocated in the exchange itself can be manipulated, that can be exploited by a platform compared to what both sellers and consumers would prefer. Specifically, this comes into play when there are indirect network effects because the participation of both sides are endogenous. It's very important to stress that when we assume the demand is fixed, so when we ignore these two-sided network effects, all of these results disappear, and the results, as in Ali et al., in which consumers benefit from more disclosure, is simply never picked up by a platform in a platform environment. And the reason why, again, is because the only reason the platform allows for this disclosure is to attract more consumers in their environment. So because of this, a platform's interests sometimes align with the sellers and sometimes align with the buyers too, but it can differ from both. And because of this, while it would be intuitive to think of the platform being in between the interest of buyers and sellers and helping generating network effects and helping generating trades, these discrepancies and this misalignment specifically arises when the platform doesn't need to do that, doesn't need to sacrifice the margin to attract more consumers and sellers and generate more trade, either because the network effects are not strong enough or because everybody is already on the platform. Which means that, in our opinion, this indicates that, especially for the most established platform, it would make sense for a regulator to mandate some form of disclosure technology to be available on e-commerce platforms, so that given that the platform wouldn't do it themselves, at least consumers would always be able to share information rather than only disclose or only taking away information, especially in competitive environments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jacopo. Tat-How, you ready? We have
Yep.
Tat-How join our discussion.
Okay, sure. So hi everyone, my name is Tat-How. So thank you for the chance to read and discuss paper. I thoroughly enjoy it. So the organizers remind me not to do any slides. So I'm just going to give my quick take on the paper's approach and then raise a few hopefully useful comments and clarifying questions. What this paper does is to put the voluntary disclosure model of Ali et al. Into a platform setting with buyer participation, seller participation, and never externalities between them. The main driving force of the analysis is that optimal disclosure regime for each site, and the platform in a fixed participation setting may change when never externalities are important enough and the fee response of the platform is considered. So I have 5 broad comments and let me briefly talk about them. So I think having a misalignment between platform and seller preference is quite natural, but what really surprised me was the direction of the misalignment. So let's take the monopoly setup. So my initial naive intuition, which Jacopo also mentioned, is that, well, consumers prefer rich evidence, sellers prefer simple evidence relatively more. And so the platform who takes both sides into consideration should prefer something in between. And so I was expecting that the platform to prefer rich evidence more than sellers do. But apparently the result is the reverse, whereby sellers actually prefer rich evidence more than the platform do. The crucial reasoning here is the endogenous fee response of the platform. In the model, a richer evidence regime leads to less trade surplus gained by the sellers, and that lower surplus induces the platform to charge a lower seller fee, and which turns out to more than compensate for the initial trade surplus loss of the sellers. Now, of course, there are more things going on here due to the network externalities, but on paper, this looks something like a more than one pass-through to me. So I think it would be great to go through this, the intricacy of this endogenous fee response a bit more, and how exactly the modeling feature drives the fee response of the platform, and how robust this feature is, because I think this fee story is the main driving force here. I was also thinking about example, and one highly relevant example mentioned in the paper and also the Ali et al. Paper is the Facebook Google, which allows users to stop being engaged with personalized ads or specific advertiser. Now, in some of these advertisement contexts, I think it is quite reasonable to imagine that this advertisement platform do not fully track the value of transaction, and so a proportional fee or percentage fee scheme may not fit sometimes. Now, I know that per unit transaction fees may mess things up, so I'm not going to suggest that, but I would love to know what happens with, let's say, seller participation fee, which can be interpreted as a proxy for ad slot pricing and per impression pricing. So my hunch is that it probably won't affect the result, but having this additional analysis would help to reinforce the idea that the current results are not driven by some special feature of the current endogenous fee response. Relatedly, if we take the third question or comment is, if we take the Facebook, Google example and also the GDPR example, then their move seems to be moving away from a situation where everyone is by default disclosed and choose whether to opt out to a situation where everyone is by default not disclosed and choose whether to opt in. And I think Ali et al. Paper has an extension on this where consumers have disclosure, consumer cost, and Jacopo definitely knows this. So I think to make the regulatory insights of the paper stronger, it would be useful to explore something like this, the opt-in, opt-out kind of thing. And okay, I still have a bit more time. I find it so the fourth comment is I do find it a bit stark that the rich evidence regime is ruled out in the duopoly model. So this is what I found in the paper when you have these parametric restrictions. So it is a bit starking because monopoly model, you have this rich evidence, which is quite prominent, but in duopoly, it is ruled out. So it would be useful to discuss a bit more in the paper on this, like what sort of condition is exactly ruling this out, and whether the current parametric assumption is sufficient or necessary, and if they are just sufficient condition, can we get some numerical examples where the RE can arise? And I think the last comment is on the duopoly setup. So in the paper, you mentioned that the setup is such that sellers of a given opportunity cost either both join or non-join. Probably I'm missing something, but I couldn't find condition that guarantee this. Intuitively, this seems to require something like monopoly profit being lower than duopoly profit. It would be good to have some clarification on this. That's all from me. Thank you.